It was 3:17 a.m. and I was starving. Not the kind of hunger you ignore or sleep through, the kind that gnaws at your stomach like a rabid dog. I had just finished a double shift at the factory, and the thought of going home to an empty fridge was enough to push me back out onto the dark, wet streets of Chicago. I knew the 24-hour McDonald's on Weston Street would still be open. I'd been there plenty of times before after late nights, but something felt off this time. The fluorescent sign flickered more than usual, casting strange, jittery shadows across the parking lot. I told myself it was nothing, just an old sign needing maintenance, and pushed through the glass door. Inside, the place was practically empty, except for a man in a gray hoodie slumped over a booth near the corner and a bored-looking cashier leaning on the counter. The air was stale, heavy, and smelled faintly of burned oil and cleaning chemicals. "Welcome to McDonald's," the cashier mumbled without looking up. His voice was flat, robotic. I walked up to the counter, glancing at the menu. I'll take a number 2. Large Coke," I said, pulling out my wallet. The cashier's hand hovered over the register, but he didn't move to punch in my order. He just stared at me, his eyes strangely blank, like he wasn't really seeing me. "You okay?" I asked, trying to shake off the creeping unease crawling up my spine. He blinked once, slowly, and then smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, stretching across his face like it didn't belong there. His teeth were wrong. Too straight, too perfect, like they'd been carved out of porcelain. "You should leave," he said, still grinning. His voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it cut through the quiet restaurant like a blade. "What?" I frowned, confused. "You should leave. Now," he repeated. His eyes darted toward the back of the restaurant, where the kitchen doors were slightly ajar. That's when I heard it. A low, wet sound, like meat being torn apart. It was faint, but it was there, just under the hum of the overhead lights and the distant sizzle of the fryer. I glanced toward the kitchen. "What's going on back there?" The cashier's smile faltered, and for a moment he looked genuinely scared. "Please," he said, his voice shaking now. "Just go. Don't look back." I should have listened to him. Any sane person would have just turned around and walked out the door. But something about the fear in his voice froze me. It wasn't the usual fear of getting caught doing something wrong. It was deeper, raw, almost primal. My stomach twisted. "I just want my food, man," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I wasn't going to let some weird cashier freak me out. The sound from the kitchen grew louder. It wasn't just one sound now. It was a symphony of sickening noises. Squelching, snapping, and something that sounded disturbingly like chewing. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but curiosity had its claws in me. I leaned slightly to the side, trying to get a better look through the gap in the kitchen doors. A shadow moved, something big, bulky, and wrong. It wasn't the shape of a person. It was hunched, with limbs that seemed too long and a neck that twisted unnaturally. For a second, I thought I saw something glint in the faint light, like wet skin or metal. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. The cashier grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. His eyes were wide now, panicked. "If you don't leave right now, you won't get another chance," he hissed. "They hear everything." "Who's they?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Before he could answer, the kitchen doors slammed open, crashing against the walls with a metallic clang. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. The thing that emerged wasn't human. It stood upright, but its body was grotesquely distorted, like someone had stretched and twisted it in ways no body should bend. Its face, or what I assumed was its face, was featureless, smooth except for a wide, lipless mouth filled with jagged teeth. It was covered in something slick and black, like oil, and its arms hung low, almost dragging on the floor. It tilted its head at me, as if studying me. Then it took a step forward, its bare feet slapping wetly against the tiles. I backed away, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. "What the hell is that?" I yelled at the cashier. The cashier didn't answer. He just bolted, sprinting toward the side exit without looking back. I wanted to follow him, I should have followed him, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were cemented to the floor. The thing took another step, and then another, moving faster than it should have been able to with its awkward, jerky gait. The smell hit me then, a rancid metallic stench that made my stomach churn. It was close now, close enough that I could see the faint shimmer of something dripping from its teeth. Suddenly, the man in the hoodie, the one slumped in the booth, shot up. He wasn't slouching after all. He was hiding. He pulled something from under the table, a long, rusted crowbar, and swung it at the creature with a roar. The thing let out a sound I can only describe as a mix between a growl and static, like a radio stuck between stations. It recoiled, but only for a moment. Then it lunged. The creature moved faster than I thought something that size could. Its elongated arms shot out, swiping at the man with the crowbar. He dodged the first strike, barely, but the second hit him square in the chest. He flew back into the booth with a sickening thud, the crowbar clattering to the floor. I snapped out of my trance and stumbled toward the exit, but the sound of the man groaning stopped me. I turned back. He was trying to crawl away, blood dripping from his mouth as he gasped for air. "Hey, over here!" I shouted, grabbing a metal tray from the counter and hurling it at the creature. It wasn't much of a plan, but it worked. The tray hit the thing's back with a dull clang, and it turned toward me, its head twisting too far, like an owl's. Its eyeless face locked onto me, and I swear I felt its gaze, cold and probing, like it was peeling me apart layer by layer. I grabbed a chair and held it in front of me like a shield, my hands shaking so hard I thought I'd drop it. The creature took a step toward me, then another. Its body twitched unnaturally, as if it was fighting against gravity itself. Just as it was about to lunge, the man in the booth let out a hoarse shout. "Hit the lights!" he yelled, pointing toward the wall behind the counter. "Do it now!" I didn't hesitate. Dropping the chair, I bolted for the light switches, the creature's guttural growl rumbling behind me. My fingers fumbled over the panel, flipping every switch I could find. The fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, then burst to full intensity, flooding the restaurant with harsh white light. The creature let out a high-pitched screech, its body convulsing violently. Smoke, or maybe steam, started rising from its slick, black skin, and it stumbled backward, clawing at its head. It looked like it was melting, its form rippling and warping as it staggered toward the kitchen. "Keep them on!" the man shouted, crawling toward the counter. His voice was desperate, but I didn't need to be told twice. I planted myself in front of the switches, my hand ready to stop anyone, or anything, from turning them off. The creature let out one last ear-splitting shriek before collapsing onto the floor, its body dissolving into a puddle of thick, black goo. The smell was overwhelming, like rotting meat mixed with burnt plastic. I gagged, covering my mouth and nose with my sleeve. The man finally reached me, clutching his side. "You're lucky you're not dead," he said, his voice rough. "Most people don't walk out of here alive." "What the hell was that thing?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "And who the hell are you?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned against the counter, trying to catch his breath. "Name's Jack," he finally said. "I've been hunting these things for months." "Hunting them," I repeated, my mind struggling to process what I'd just seen. "What are they?" Jack shook his head. "Don't know exactly. They started showing up in places like this, small 24-hour spots. They feed on people, mostly the ones who won't be missed. Homeless folks, drunks, people like us who work late and don't have anyone waiting for them at home." I stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. "And you just fight them? Alone?" "Not by choice," he said, wincing as he adjusted his position. "Someone's gotta do it. You can't exactly call the cops for this kind of thing." The room fell silent, except for the hum of the lights and the distant sound of sirens. I hadn't even noticed someone calling 911. The cashier was gone, the doors to the kitchen swinging lightly in his wake. "Look," Jack said, pulling himself upright. "You don't want any part of this. Go home, forget what you saw. If you're smart, you'll never come back to this McDonald's. or any other one after midnight. I wanted to argue, to demand more answers, but deep down, I knew he was right. My gut told me I'd already pushed my luck too far tonight. I stood there, staring at Jack, trying to wrap my head around everything he had just said. My legs felt weak, and my heart was still pounding in my chest. The creature's remains were still oozing across the floor, a disgusting, viscous black puddle that hissed and bubbled faintly as it seeped into the cracks between the tiles. "What happens if someone turns off the lights?" I asked quietly. Jack gave me a grim look, his face pale but resolute. "You don't want to find out." The sirens grew louder, and blue and red lights flashed against the windows. Jack straightened up, wincing from the pain in his side, and grabbed the crowbar from the floor. "I can't be here when they show up," he muttered. "Cops don't get it. They just make it worse." "What am I supposed to tell them?" I asked, panicked. "I can't explain this." I motioned toward the puddle of goo that was now starting to stain the tiles with an inky residue. "Tell them you don't know anything," Jack said firmly. "Tell them you ran into some junkie who freaked out, smashed the place up, and then ran off. Whatever you do, don't mention the thing you saw. They'll lock you up, or worse." I wanted to argue, but there wasn't time. Jack was already limping toward the back exit, his crowbar in hand. Before he disappeared into the alley, he paused and turned back to me. "Stay out of places like this after dark. You don't want to see what else is out there," he said. Then he was gone, swallowed by the shadows outside. I stood there, frozen, as the police stormed into the restaurant. They immediately started asking questions, but I could barely form coherent sentences. I stuck to Jack's story. Something about a crazed man smashing up the place before running off. They didn't seem entirely convinced, but the bizarre state of the restaurant gave them enough to keep them distracted. Eventually, they let me go. I stumbled out into the night, the cold air hitting me like a slap in the face. My car was parked a block away, and as I walked toward it, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting that thing, or something worse, to come crawling out of the darkness. When I finally made it home, I locked every door and window and left every light in the house on. Sleep was out of the question. I sat on the couch, replaying everything that had happened in my mind, trying to convince myself that it wasn't real. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing. Its two long limbs, its lipless grin, its eyeless face staring straight into my soul. The next morning, I decided to dig into the story, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I searched for anything about strange incidents at late-night McDonald's locations, but most of the stories I found were vague, dismissed as urban legends or hallucinations caused by sleep deprivation and drugs. But the more I looked, the more I found. Reports of disappearances, strange sightings, even attacks, all at small 24-hour fast food spots, just like the one I'd been in. I never went back to that McDonald's or any McDonald's again. In fact, I avoided late-night food altogether. But I can't forget what happened. Even now, I don't know if that thing was truly gone or if it's still out there, waiting for the next unlucky soul to wander in after midnight. And sometimes, late at night, when I pass by darkened windows or hear the distant hum of fluorescent lights, I swear I can hear it. That low, wet sound, like meat being torn apart. For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the paranoia. I started avoiding late shifts, turning down overtime at the factory even though I needed the money. I kept my lights on at home every night. My dreams were haunted by flashes of that creature, its jagged teeth and the strange, static-filled growls that seemed to echo in my mind long after I woke up. But eventually, life moved on. I convinced myself it had been a one-time thing, something I was unlucky enough to stumble into. I started sleeping better. I started feeling normal again. Then, about 2 months later, I saw him, Jack. It was at a gas station just outside the city. I'd pulled in for fuel and a cup of coffee, still shaking off the morning fog. When I stepped inside, I spotted him immediately. He was sitting in a corner booth, hunched over a map with a cup of untouched coffee in front of him. He looked worse than before. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and bloodshot, like he hadn't slept in days. For a moment, I debated whether I should approach him, but then he looked up, and his eyes locked onto mine. There was no hesitation, no recognition that I was a familiar face. He simply stared at me, his expression grim. Against my better judgment, I walked over to him. "Jack?" I asked cautiously. He didn't respond at first. His eyes flicked to the door, then back to me. Finally, he sighed and motioned for me to sit. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, his voice even rougher than before. "I could say the same to you," I replied, sitting across from him. "You look terrible. What's going on?" Jack shook his head. "They're spreading," he muttered, his fingers tracing lines on the map in front of him. "More of them, different spots. It's not just McDonald's anymore." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean, spreading?" I thought we killed it." Jack let out a bitter laugh. "You don't kill these things. Not really. You might slow them down, drive them off, but they don't stop. They find new places, new people to prey on." He pushed the map toward me. It was covered in red circles, each one marking a location. Fast food chains, gas stations, 24-hour diners. The circles were scattered across the city, spreading outward like a plague. "What do they want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jack's face darkened. "To feed, to grow, and eventually to take over." I stared at the map, my stomach churning. "Why are you telling me this?" Jack leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Because you've seen them. They know your face now. They don't forget." A cold chill ran down my spine. "What does that mean?" "It means you're a loose end," he said grimly. "You're not safe. Not anywhere." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but deep down, I knew he was right. I could feel it. An itch at the back of my mind, a sense of being watched, even when I was alone. Jack stood up abruptly, grabbing his crowbar and a battered backpack. "Leave town," he said as he slung the bag over his shoulder. "Get as far away as you can. And if you see anything out of the ordinary, anything, you run. Don't try to be a hero." He left without another word, disappearing into the early morning fog. That was the last time I saw Jack. Now, I keep moving, never staying in one place for too long. I avoid fast food, late nights, and empty streets. But sometimes, even in the safest places, I can feel it. The weight of eyes watching me from the shadows, the faint hum of static just beyond hearing. And every once in a while, I catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. Something tall and twisted, with two long limbs and a lipless grin. They're still out there, and they're getting closer. Months passed, and I thought I was getting better at staying ahead of it, whatever it was. I changed cities twice, switched jobs, and lived in cheap motels, constantly watching my back. But the paranoia didn't leave. Every fluorescent sign flickering at night felt like a warning. Every faint hum of electricity or static put me on edge. Then, one night, I made a mistake. I was driving through a small town in Nebraska, the kind of place where everything shuts down after 9 p.m. It was late, almost 1 a.m., and I'd been on the road all day, running on fumes. I passed a brightly lit gas station and told myself I'd stop at the next place for food. Another 15 minutes passed, then 30. There wasn't another place for miles. And then I saw it, a McDonald's. It looked normal, bright, clean, and almost welcoming. Standing alone on the edge of the highway, my stomach growled, and my head ached from hours of driving. Against every instinct screaming at me to keep going, I pulled into the parking lot. As soon as I stepped out of the car, the unease hit me. The parking lot was empty, except for a single car parked near the dumpsters. A beat-up station wagon with a cracked rear window. The wind was still, the air unnaturally quiet, like the world was holding its breath. But I told myself I was imagining things. I was tired, hungry, and being paranoid. It was just a McDonald's. The moment I walked inside, I knew I'd made a mistake. The cashier, a woman this time, stared at me as I approached the counter. Her face was pale, her expression hollow, like she hadn't slept in weeks. "Welcome to McDonald's," she said, her voice eerily monotone. It was the exact same lifeless tone I'd heard months ago in Chicago. "I'll take a number 3, I said, my voice faltering. She didn't move to input my order. Instead, she leaned forward, lowering her voice. "You need to leave. Right now." My stomach dropped. "What?" Her eyes darted toward the kitchen, and I noticed her hands were trembling. "They're here," she whispered. "If you stay, they'll—" The sound cut her off. That low, wet noise, the one I'd hoped to never hear again. It came from the kitchen, faint at first, but growing louder. Tearing, chewing, slurping. My legs locked up, and for a moment I couldn't move. It was just like before. The air felt heavy, the lights above buzzing louder than they should. The cashier's breathing quickened, and she grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "You have to go," she hissed. "They know you're here. The kitchen doors slammed open. This time there were two of them. The creatures were even worse than I remembered. Their bodies seemed bigger, more grotesque. One had a head that twitched and tilted unnaturally, its jaw opening and closing with sickening clicks. The other was hunched over, its elongated arms dragging across the floor, its lipless mouth stretched into a permanent grin. The cashier screamed, but it didn't matter. They lunged. I grabbed a chair and threw it, the clattering sound buying me seconds as the creatures turned their heads toward the noise. The cashier bolted toward the back exit, but one of the creatures was faster. Its arm shot out, grabbing her by the leg and dragging her across the floor. She screamed, her nails scraping against the tiles as she fought to get free. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran. Bursting out the front door, I sprinted to my car, fumbling with my keys as the sound of the cashier's screams echoed in my ears. Behind me, the creatures emerged, their eyeless faces glowing faintly under the flickering parking lot lights. I threw myself into the driver's seat, started the car, and slammed on the gas. As I sped out of the parking lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The creatures were just standing there, watching, their bodies silhouetted against the glowing McDonald's sign. But they weren't alone. Behind them, through the restaurant's glass windows, I saw more shadows. Dozens of them, twisted figures, barely visible in the faint light, all standing still, all watching me. I didn't stop driving until the sun came up. Now I know the truth. They're multiplying, they're spreading, and they're getting bolder. It's not just McDonald's anymore. It's everywhere. Gas stations, diners, even grocery stores. Anywhere open late, anywhere quiet and isolated, anywhere they can pick off the stragglers. If you're reading this, remember, don't go out late at night. Don't stop at empty places. And if you ever hear that wet, tearing sound, don't look back. They're out there, and they're hungry. For weeks after that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what I saw. Not just the creatures, their eyeless faces, their grotesque, warped forms, but the shadows. Dozens of them, standing behind the glass like silent witnesses. They were organizing. I knew it. The thought haunted me everywhere I went. I kept moving city to city, town to town, trying to stay ahead of them. But the more I ran, the more I realized how pointless it was. Every time I stopped for gas or food, I'd notice something. A flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. A faint static buzz that shouldn't have been there. A clerk or cashier who looked just a little too pale, their hands trembling as they avoided my gaze. They were everywhere now. It wasn't just late-night fast food or diners anymore. The infestation had spread. Airports, convenience stores, even crowded malls. I could feel them watching me, waiting for me to slip up. And then, 2 nights ago, it happened. I was staying in a rundown motel just off the highway in Kansas. The kind of place where the doors barely lock, and the TV hums louder than it plays. I thought I'd finally found a safe spot, a quiet place to rest, just for one night. I was wrong. It started with the lights. Around 2 a.m., the flickering began. The overhead lamp buzzed and dimmed, casting long, twitching shadows across the room. I froze, staring at the light, willing it to stop. But it didn't. The buzzing grew louder, and then the TV turned to static. That same sickening hum. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door. My instincts were screaming at me to get out. But when I opened the door, the hallway was dark, pitch black, except for the faint red glow of the exit sign at the far end. That's when I heard it. The sound I'd been dreading. That low, wet noise, like meat being ripped apart, coming from somewhere behind me. I didn't turn around. Couldn't. I sprinted down the hallway, my heart hammering in my chest, the sound growing louder with every step. The air felt thick, heavy, like I was running through water. When I reached the exit door, I threw it open and stumbled into the parking lot. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I ran to my car, yanking the door open and throwing myself inside. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But then, just as I turned the key, I saw them. They were standing at the edge of the parking lot, silhouetted against the faint glow of the motel sign. At least 6 of them, their twisted, inhuman forms barely visible in the darkness. And behind them I saw the shadows, dozens, maybe hundreds, moving in the distance, shifting and swaying like a swarm. They weren't just hunting anymore. They were gathering. The engine roared to life and I slammed on the gas, speeding out of the lot and onto the empty highway. My rearview mirror was filled with darkness, but I knew they were there. I could feel them, the weight of their gaze pressing down on me even as I drove miles away. Now I don't stop. I don't rest. I keep moving, keep driving, because I know if I stop, they'll find me. I don't know how long I can keep this up. I don't know how far I can run. But if you're reading this, consider it your warning. They're not just in one place anymore. They're spreading, growing, evolving. And they're coming for us. So if you ever find yourself on a quiet road late at night, passing by a brightly lit McDonald's or a lonely gas station, keep driving. Don't stop. Don't look back. Because once they see you, they won't stop until they've had their fill.